God's plans are better than yours. Let's read Jeremiah chapter 29 and verse 11. It says, "For I know the thoughts that I think toward you, saith the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you an expected end." Now this passage I've heard many times people use as an encouraging passage, a passage to build each other up, a passage to remind people that God has your best interests in His mind. However, the context for this verse really shifts around what this verse is talking about. I'd like to start out by just saying that no matter where you find yourself, God has plans for your life. If we go back to verse number 1 here in Jeremiah chapter 29, let's start at the beginning. "Now these are the words of the letter that Jeremiah the prophet sent from Jerusalem unto the residue of the elders which were carried away captives, and to the priests and to the prophets and to all the people whom Nebuchadnezzar had carried away captive from Jerusalem to Babylon." So this letter, of course most of Jeremiah and Isaiah and several other books, takes place during the Babylonian captivity of the Jews. So this was not a pleasant place, this was not a happy place, this was not a time of rejoicing. This was a great time of fear upon God's people. This was a time of punishment. This was a time of judgment, a time of separation from God. In verse 4, it tells us, "Thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, unto all that are carried away captives, whom I have caused to be carried away from Jerusalem unto Babylon." This captivity, this turmoil, this stress that they were under is because God let it happen. In fact, God made it happen because of their unfaithfulness to Him. If we go back to Jeremiah chapter 25 and starting in verse 4, it says, "And the Lord hath sent unto you all His servants the prophets, rising early and sending them. But ye have not hearkened nor inclined your ear to hear." God had been warning His people over and over and over again about the coming collapse, the coming doom, the coming judgment if they didn't listen. Verse 5, "They said, Turn ye again now every one from his evil way and from the evil of your doings, and dwell in the land that the Lord hath given unto you and to your fathers forever and ever. And go not after other gods to serve them and to worship them, and provoke me not to anger with the works of your hands, and I will do you no hurt. Yet ye have not hearkened unto me, saith the Lord, that ye might provoke me to anger with the works of your hands to your own hurt." Verse 8, "Therefore thus saith the Lord of hosts, because ye have not heard my words, behold, I will send and take all the families of the north, saith the Lord, and Nebuchadrezzar the king of Babylon, my servant, and will bring them against this land, and against the inhabitants thereof, and against all these nations round about, and will utterly destroy them, and make them an astonishment, and an hissing, and perpetual desolations. Moreover, I will take from them the voice of mirth, and the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom, and the voice of the bride, the sound of the millstones, and the light of the candle. And this whole land shall be a desolation and an astonishment, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. This is the context for Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 11. This is the surrounding circumstances when God says, "I know the thoughts that I think towards you, saith the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you an expected end." In other words, you might be in the middle of the worst time of your life because you messed everything up. You might be in the middle of a punishment brought unto you because you disobeyed God, you sought other gods, you turned your back on your Creator, and God says, in the middle of that, "I know the thoughts that I think toward you. I'm still thinking peace towards you, not of evil, to give you an expected end." That word expected is the word tiqvah. It literally means a cord. We use this phrase in English all of the time. I'm at the end of my rope. I'm holding on to that one last little bit of hope, and I'm about to let go of it. And God says, in the midst of times that are dark, even things we've messed up, He says, "I will bring you a cord." Figuratively, this word means expectancy, hope, to live, or the thing that I long for. Let's talk about the theme surrounding God's plans for us. The theme surrounding His plans always goes back to our response to God. His plan for us, his idea, his desire for us is for us to forsake our will for his. Again, back to the theme, the title, God's plans are better than yours. Go with me to Isaiah chapter 55, and we'll start at verse number 6. Seek ye the Lord while he may be found. Call ye upon him while he is near. Let the wicked forsake his way, and the unrighteous man his thoughts. And let him return unto the Lord, and he will have mercy upon him, and to our God, for he will abundantly pardon. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, saith the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. God's plans for us far supersede our own, far outweigh our own. You can take the smartest person on earth, you can take the most intelligent person, you could take someone who has thought through every detail, every possibility as they plan their life, as they plan their day. It's not going to compare to what God's plan is for your life, to what God's plan is for your day, for your time, for your very minute by minute. The creator of the universe knows how things work. Verse 9, he says, as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways. He can see everything. He's sitting up above all of it, and he can look down upon it and see everything that's happening at any given moment. He understands the long view as well as the small view. He can zoom in and out whenever and however he wants to. The scripture says that the eyes of the Lord go throughout the entire earth. He's able to see everything. So he's not mistaken. He has not forgotten where you are and what's going on. And he still says, my plans are better than yours. But the problem is, man has had trouble following the Creator's plans since the very beginning. I mean, you go all the way back to Genesis, we're talking about Adam and Eve, of course. Let's go over to chapter number 2, verse number 16. The Lord God commanded the man, and what did he tell him? He said, of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat. So here's what you can do. Verse 17, here's what you can't do. But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, thou shalt not eat of it. For in the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die. All right, he didn't make any qualms about it. He didn't say it's a possibility you would die. He didn't say, you might have some options at that point. No, he said, do this and this will happen. Do this and this will happen. Cause and effect. We move over to chapter number 3, verse number 6. And what's going on? When the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof, and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat. Now you could argue about whose fault it was, and who should have been looking out. They both ate. They both disobeyed the Creator's commandment. Then you go down to verse number 16, and we see, unto the woman he said, this is God speaking, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children, and thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee. So she's getting punishment. She's getting consequence. Verse 17, unto Adam he said, because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and hast eaten of the tree of which I commanded thee, saying, thou shalt not eat of it. Cursed is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. Thorns also and thistles shall it bring forth to thee, and thou shalt eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground. For out of it wast thou taken, for dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return. Now we're only 3 chapters in, and this was right after the most glorious creation that we see as we read in the first few chapters of Genesis, and already mankind has failed in following God's plans. Mankind has placed his own will above God's will, and in doing so has ruined his own life and the life of every generation to follow. In Genesis chapter 4, starting in verse number 3, we see that next generation right after them, Cain, that firstborn, giving up and messing up already as the firstborn under Adam and Eve, messing up his own life because he refused to offer an acceptable sacrifice. Chapter number 4, verse number 3 says, and in process of time it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord. And Abel he also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of the fat thereof. And the Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering, but unto Cain and to his offering he had not respect. And Cain was very wroth, and his countenance fell. And we see here that Cain had a relationship with God. He spoke with God. The Lord said unto Cain in verse 6, Why art thou wroth? And why is thy countenance fallen? If thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted? And if thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door. And unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him. All right, so already we see Cain dealing with his problems then. Immediately, what does he do? He resorts to murder to deal with this problem. He gets jealous and he resorts to violence instead of seeking God's favor. We see here he could have talked to God. He could have said, God, what's wrong? What do I need to change? How can I conform to your will? How can I fall in line with your plan? But instead of doing that, instead of asking God what his ideas were, instead of asking God the proper and correct way to live his life, he gets jealous of his brother and he ends up murdering him. Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and slew him. And the Lord said unto Cain, Where is Abel thy brother? And he said, I know not. Am I my brother's keeper? And he said, What hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground. And now art thou cursed from the earth, which hath opened her mouth to receive thy brother's blood from thy hand. When thou tillest the ground, it shall not henceforth yield unto thee her strength. A fugitive and a vagabond shalt thou be in the earth. And Cain said unto the Lord, My punishment is greater than I can bear. Cain refused to offer an acceptable sacrifice. He turned to jealousy, he turned to murder, and because of that, he ended up outside of the will of God, and therefore outside the blessings of God as well. Another favorite verse when it comes to the plans of God for our life is Romans chapter 8 and verse number 28. Now, Romans chapter 8 is a great chapter. I recommend reading it to anyone who's seeking to know God more and to make sure that they are following after God properly. But verse 28 is where we're going to focus. The whole chapter talks about being in the Spirit, following the Spirit of God. Romans chapter 8 verse 28 says, And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. God's plans are good for those who love him and those who are called to serve him. Now that's important. We're going to look at that in just a moment. Deuteronomy chapter 11 and verse 26. Back to the Old Testament, Deuteronomy 11, verse number 26. We see that this is a theme that goes all the way from the Old Testament, we saw in Genesis, all the way through the entire scriptures. Verse 26 says, Behold, I set before you this day a blessing and a curse. All right, so you follow God's plans and you get a blessing, you leave God's plans and you get a curse. Verse 27, a blessing if ye obey the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you this day, and a curse if you will not obey the commandments of the Lord your God, but turn aside out of the way which I command you this day, to go after other gods which ye have not known. One of the things that seems to confuse a lot of people, because it's a spiritual concept, is this idea that I can earn God's favor by doing good deeds. That is not what God's telling us here. He's basically laying out the laws of the universe. I've come to use the term spiritual physics a lot when I'm discussing this with friends and family. He's saying when you do things this way, this is what happens. It's already going to happen. It's not like God gets offended and God gets upset and then he smites you because you did him wrong. He's just saying this is because of who I am and because of how the universe works, because it emanated from me, this is what happens. It's just like gravity. It's just like any natural law in physics, thermodynamics, all of those things. Spiritually, there's the same type of laws in place. A blessing for obedience and a curse for disobedience. Jesus himself, everyone likes to say that Jesus was just about love and light and all of those things, and he was, but John chapter 14, the same God who created the earth, the same God who gave down the law in the Old Testament, manifested himself in the flesh, Jesus Christ, in John chapter 14, starting in verse number 15. What does he tell us? He says, if ye love me, keep my commandments. So that love that he talks about all throughout, that love that he manifested, that he showed to us in his sacrifice on the cross, he says, if you're going to love me, if you claim to love me, you're going to keep my commandments. You're going to obey the things I have said. And verse number 16, and I will pray the Father, and he shall give you another comforter, that he may abide with you forever, even the Spirit of truth. Here we're going back to the Holy Spirit talked about in Romans 8. whom the world cannot receive, because it seeth him not, neither knoweth him. But ye know him, for he dwelleth with you, and shall be in you. I will not leave you comfortless, I will come to you. Yet a little while, and the world seeth me no more. But ye see me, because I live, ye shall live also. At that day ye shall know that I am in my Father, and ye in me, and I in you. He that hath my commandments, and keepeth them, he it is that loveth me. And he that loveth me shall be loved of my Father, and I will love him, and will manifest myself to him. For God, this isn't a matter of how he feels or his opinion on a given day. This is who he is. Those who love him obey his commandments. If you go read 1 John, he says again and again that unless you are living according to God's way, you can't claim the title of Christian. You can't say, well, I love God, well, I'm one of God's children, well, I've been born again, and you don't actually fulfill God's commandments. You don't actually obey the things that he said. You don't actually live out God's plans and sacrifice your own life, your own plans for his. Back to Romans chapter 8 and verse number 28. It starts out with this phrase, for we know, and we know that all things work together. He's building a case here, throughout the chapter, but he's making this statement here very clearly. We know that all things, everything, every possible thing, work together, so these are all coordinated, right, for good. To whom? To them that love God. Who loves God? We just looked at it. Those who love God are those who obey his commandments. To them who are the called according to his purpose. Now the called are those who have been chosen by God, those who have been called out, those who have been invited. Let's go over to Revelation chapter 17. We'll finish up in Revelation 17, verse number 14. I like to use this phrase sometimes, Team Jesus, because when you quote-unquote get saved, when you're born again, when you decide to leave behind the world and its systems and the devil and his temptations, and you say, I want to live for Jesus, I want to join his team, I want to join his family, I want to be a member, I want to be in the kingdom. When you do that, you're joining up with Team Jesus. You're leaving every other team. Jesus is very exclusive. You can't live for yourself, you can't live for the devil, you can't live for the world and live for Jesus at the same time. He says, you live for me, you're one of mine, or you're not. Revelation 17 verse 14, this is of course speaking of things to come, and it says, these shall make war with the Lamb. So there are those who would try to take on God himself, and the Lamb shall overcome them. And shall, when you see the word shall show up, that's a promise. The Lamb shall overcome them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings. And they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful. If you are on Team Jesus, or you say that you are, this has to define your life. You're called, in other words, you're invited or appointed. You're chosen, meaning that you're selected. You are a special group. You're a favorite, is what that word means. And you're faithful. You're trustworthy or true. Now, there's a lot of arguments between a lot of people who say that they know the ideas of predestination or not predestination, and a lot of mess has gone on because of that. This verse ties these ideas together. If you're on Team Jesus, you are invited. You've been invited. You've been chosen, and you are trustworthy. You're true. That's a choice you make. That's an action you take to live out the things God's called you to live out. So in conclusion, we go back to Jeremiah. No matter where you find yourself, God has plans for your life. In Isaiah, we see that the theme surrounding God's plans for us is forsaking our will for his. We're not obeying our lusts of the flesh, we're obeying God's commandments. Romans 8:28, God's plans are good for who? Those who love him, meaning they obey him, they follow him, and they're called to serve him. The next time you have a bright idea, the next time you think, I know what I'm going to do with my life, the next time you say, I'm going to figure this out, I can get into this, I can get out of this, I can get to where I want to go using my own power, just remember, God's plans are better than yours. Seek His will. Talk to God. He wants to know you, and He wants you to know Him more. And He has a plan for you that's greater than anything you can ever come up with, if you will listen.